or something like that. So we'll just switch in the end, doesn't technology but you better take that back.
Yes.
Somewhere you missed.
Yeah, I lose these.
Looks like it's working.
I think so.
So I'm getting this.
Yeah.
With let's try. What do we get if we
Turn the projector on.
Awesome!
quite disastrous? It should be like more like that.
Well, now it means
well, I can just use it here over to just have a look.
Right. So I think the link won't go straight.
Right.
Whatever it is, because we're sharing the
Yeah.
application.
I mean, I have a hyperlink that I can click on, so I think it's
Right. So it'll be fine for here. I think it will. Yeah.
I expected more turnout, but I think we'll assume that it's also midterm, so everyone's taking a rest, I guess. Welcome to yours. I'm really excited to be able to introduce you to Professor Chris Whitehead, who's come down from Newcastle. He's a professor of museology there and also has professorial status at the University of Oslo. So we were talking about how he juggles multiple professorships at once, which is very impressive, I think. Chris has held a variety of positions inside and outside of academia, including previously as a curator. And has affiliations with ICOM and all those big museological organizations that are setting the policy agendas for institutions worldwide. He also is working on several large international projects right now, including one based in Turkey, which we were just discussing, which is a Newton-funded project called Plural Heritages, which has a digital media component close to my heart, and then the COHERE project, which he's going to be discussing in more detail now. So I'll just say we're live, as far as I can tell, on YouTube, thanks to Harold. And if you're listening online and want to submit questions, you can do so through Twitter using the hashtag yours, YOHRS. And otherwise, I'll just turn it over to Chris. Thank you so much for coming up to speak to us.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the lovely introduction. It's very impressive that you can remember all of that. So thank you all for coming. What I'm going to talk about today is this project, which is the Critical Heritages European Commission funded project under the Reflective Societies strand. And I suppose I'm going to try and explain some of the concepts around it, but it's also a little bit of a story about this project itself and what happened to it, because this is a project that is about commonality across the European territory. What European Union versus Europe is a problematic question in itself. It's a project that was born out of a desire on the part of the European Commission to identify and valorize a singular European heritage. And this all came out in the reflective scheme that we responded to in 2014. And so there is a kind of narrative about what happened to this project and what happened to the ideals that are embedded within the funding and the instrumental agendas that are embedded within it after that, okay, not least in the context of Brexit, but not only that. So that's really the story that I'll tell you. And this is the project itself. I dare not click on this actually, but this will take you to the link. So this is a very, very brief summary. It seeks to identify, understand, and valorize European heritages. So already we went for the plural as a kind of escape from the European Commission's imperative of singular heritage, engaging with its social, political, and cultural significance and the potential for developing communitarian identities. And the idea here was that we would address an intensifying EU crisis, and that construct of EU crisis is not ours. That was actually embedded within the call for funding. And that's an EU crisis which is multifaceted, partly economic, partly a crisis of confidence in the social and political and perhaps also ethical project of the European Union, perhaps a crisis around identities. So we have taken that kind of paradigm, and I'll show you later on how in some way I've tried to mold that into a slightly more theorized frame than you can find in the EU literature, through a study of relations between identities, representations, and performances of history. And one of the things that we set out in our project was that we were interested also in the way in which heritages can be used for division and isolation, as well as to find common ground and to encourage modern visions and uses of the past, uses of the European past. And this is a quotation also from European Commission thinking and literature. So this was a little bit of a gamble, which is to say, to try and give the European Commission what they didn't ask for. They asked for unity and not for divisiveness and division. But this really is about a kind of realist imperative within our research, not to create some kind of mythic happy fiction of a shared identity that traverses all of Europe, which clearly doesn't. So that's really the project. There's a very large consortium. I'm not going to read all of this, and there are very different work packages. And because of the breadth of this project, I'm only going to talk about some aspects of it. And I'll talk particularly about my areas of interest, which are towards the first and possibly the second work packages that you can see here. And the first work package, one of the contexts that particularly interests me as a museologist, sometime museologist, is the museum. And so I'll try and exemplify some of the problems that we have in that context. Another thing with as if any of you are involved in European funding, as I know Sarah is, some of you may well be as well, is that there is the idea that you should have some kind of impact on practice and policy. So what does that mean in tangible terms? Does it mean that you will produce exhibitions and influence the hearts and minds of the visitors who go to see them? Who are those visitors? Does it mean that you will produce policy briefs? What will those policy briefs contain, and who will read them? Or will they end up on a shelf in Brussels gathering dust, which is my experience in the previous project. So how, in other words, can you have some kind of effect on practice, or are we just spending a lot of money to theorize what has already been quite well theorized in various literatures across heritage studies, memory studies, theory of history, uses of the past, and all of those sorts of fields? So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So we explore the ways in which identities in Europe are constructed through heritage representations and performances. So there is quite an emphasis on representation. That could be a museum display, It could be a representation within a political speech. So it could be a matter of political discourse and political talk. With performances, we also mean various things. We might mean a performance in the literal sense. So, for example, we're interested in music as an expression of heritage. And we can take musical performances as something quite literal, or in the sense, the sort of sociological tradition of Anthony Giddens, we can talk about the skilled performance of society. And we're interested in ideas about place and history and tradition and belonging, and how these are mobilized, not just by official bodies and by authorized organizations like museums or the European Commission itself, but also at different levels, at from below, in the context of from below heritage, from community levels, the level of the individual as well. Because heritage at the level of the individual, even heritage that is not really shared, that is only precious to one individual, can have a momentous effect, as I will show you in a minute. Identifying the means to sustain and transmit European heritages, and this is part of the instrumental agenda of the project, that are likely to contribute to the evolution of inclusive communitarian identities and counteract disaffection with and division within the EU. Now this, again, as I said, was written in 2014, 2015, so a lot has changed since then. For better or for worse is up to you to decide. And also exploring multiple modes of representation and performance, and across various spheres, from the sphere of cultural policy, museum display, interpretation, school curricula, music, dance, as I said, even food and cuisine, as well as things like protests, as I'll show you some examples. Now, as part of this, as part of the grant application process, we committed the hubristic sin of trying to define heritage. And if any of you are heritage studies or are engaged with heritage studies as a field, you'll know that there's nothing we like more than trying to define heritage and failing, as exceptions to the rule then cause problems for your definition, and it goes round and round. Nevertheless, here it is. So this is an idea of heritage, a working definition, if you like, as a representational, discursive and performative practice involving conscious attempts to valorize aspects of the past and the present. This is not an exclusive definition, and if any of you have witnessed all of the debates that have gone on in the context of critical heritage studies about non-representational manifestations of heritage, past presencing, all of these kinds of ideas, you'll see that this is a particular take on practice that's interested in representation. It can be official or unofficial, tangible or intangible, or mixtures of these. It may not always be a social good, and I'll come back to that, of perceived to be progressive identities, respectful intergroup relations, or benign moral positions, and so on. So there is this idea here of conflicting, a possibility for a conflict, and no single monolithic common heritage, which goes back to the pluralization of the term. So part of this is about interest in things that do bring people together, and this is a case which happened a couple of weeks ago, I think, in Shetland, happens every year. And I think even you have here in York, there will be a Viking festival here very shortly in the next couple of weeks. That is not necessarily about authenticity. I think this was last year's festival. So this is really plural heritages, you know, and I appreciate this because Star Wars is, you know, I'm in my 40s now, so I grew up with Star Wars. So to a degree, this is my heritage as well. So on the one hand, we're thinking about this, but on the other hand, we're thinking also about divisive heritages and mobilizations of heritage that you see here. So this is Anders Breivik's rifle. You'll remember his massacre of, I think, something like 72 people some years ago in Oslo and the island of Utøya. And he mobilized heritage in various ways to power his violent acts. with a melange of interests in crusaders, in Norse mythology, in a kind of anti-multiculturalist, Islamophobic sense. And this is what I mean in a sense about, you know, whose heritage, who is attaching to and mobilizing heritage. And actually this is something which has profound effects within Norwegian society and makes life profoundly, it makes sustaining a particular political position of multiculturalism and promotion of diversity and difference within society quite difficult because of the threat of deadly force. And this is connected to a whole history of kind of democratic pluralist resistance that then emerged out of 2011 as a result of this in Norway. But the point here is that heritage is used in what we might consider to be a non-progressive, malign sense. And the question of who is the we is always really critical in heritage studies generally, and it is here too. And also we think about connections and disconnections with events. So another problem in heritage studies is what, you know, do you think about heritage as something that we choose? Is it something that we choose to take with us from the past, which is an idea from Rodney Harrison's work, for the construction of some kind of civil future? So then you have the problem of what about the things that we don't choose to take with us? Is that memory and not heritage? Or can we say that we actually live with heritage, whether we like it or not, that some heritages actually befall us, rather than being chosen by us? And I use this as an example here. If any of you have been to Milan, you possibly won't have been here, because this is a kind of quite anonymous, not particularly nice place to be. Piazzale Loreto. Medium-rise identikit buildings, a large traffic interchange, very noisy, with no particular commemoration of anything. It doesn't seem like a site of memory. It's certainly not on the tourist route, and yet this in 1945 was the site where Mussolini's body was hung to be stoned by an angry mob, along with those of his closest collaborators. So this is a site of, well, I think of it as a kind of a site of organized forgetting. The city has been allowed to rise to obliterate traces of this uncomfortable memory, this unsettling memory. So this is about disconnection as well as connection. So we can connect in Shetland to the Viking past, but we can also disconnect from this particular past. So we're interested in these things too. Then there's this issue of critical, we call it critical heritages. And I'm sometimes asked, what do you mean by critical heritage? Because there is this strand that has been going for probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years now of critical heritage studies, which is a bit of a turn, interested in cultural politics, mythic constructs of the past, power relations, thinking about heritage, and particularly authorized heritage as a site of power relations, as articulated here by Laura Jane Smith in the roundup of thinking about critical heritage studies in the IJHS in 2012. So that's one way of thinking about it. It can align with that in a disciplinary sense or in a field sense. Another way is to think about the word crisis, which seems to be mobilized a lot at the European level. So that's quite handy. The Oxford English Dictionary calls this a time of intense difficulty and danger, where and when, and we can also think about where and when heritage has a decisive or crucial importance in the success, failure, or existence of something, when it is critical for something. And then there's a question about, well, what something or some things is heritage actually critical for? Could it be critical for the survival or maintenance or realization of peaceful social intergroup relations, for example? In what kinds of crises does it figure, and how do those crises actually connect to historic phenomena that we might be interested in? So that's a kind of a background to the idea of critical, which I'm trying to show you there is used in various ways. So I'll take you on a little run through of some work packages. There are only 6. And then I'll try and exemplify some themes that that come out of some of them. I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on this one because I'm, as well as coordinating the project, I'm also the leader of this work package, and it's the one I'm most familiar with in terms of themes. Some of the others about music and food are more alien to me. So this one looks at, provides a kind of foundation for the project as a whole. We engage in a lot of this kind of thinking about definitions, historical constructions, mythologies, representations of Europe, formative histories for European identities, not just the ones that are on view, but also the ones that we don't see so much because of whatever historical, political, sensitive circumstances and non-official heritage around these contexts. So on the official level, one of the sites that we're busy researching is this one here, which is the House of European History in Brussels, which is a grand projet by on the part of the European Commission itself. It's not open yet, it's opening in spring. And this will tell the story of Europe from the EU EC perspective. And things like when the story starts and who it includes and who it doesn't are always interesting in this context. So this story starts in 1945. So reproducing a kind of an idea of the negative founding myth, the Holocaust and the Second World War, generate the EU as a machine of peace that is born out of the ashes of conflict, a never again kind of history. We're also looking, for example, at representations of Europe in other contexts. So the Europe galleries that have been opened at the V&A, and they have got very different dates, from 1600 to 1815. So why? Yeah, it's not that, we know what happened in 1815, but why that particular choice, right? So how is Europe framed in these different histories? And also, what does it include and exclude? Does it always start with Hellenistic antiquity, for example? Work package 2, as you can see, is quite a contentious one, and it's causing us no little difficulties in terms of security and ethical clearances. Investigating popular discourses and dominant understandings of a homogeneous European heritage and the exclusion of groups such as minorities from a stronger inclusion into European society. So this too, in some senses, is about historical mythologies. So for example, the right-wing populist attachment to historical events like the Siege of Vienna in 1683 as mobilized as a symbol or as a way of saying that Europe should be Christian, and a way of articulating relations with otherness and articulating an exclusive identity position, things like that. Work package 3, cultural forms and expressions of identity in Europe, traditions, how they are maintained, how they are sustained, and in particular here we're looking at language, tourism, music, and festivals. You might already have gathered from this that this is massively interdisciplinary. There's about 60 people working on the project as a whole, from people like me in museum studies, heritage studies, to political scientists, social anthropologists, historians, archaeologists, education specialists, and musicologists, and so on, and musicians as well, as you can see here. The roles of digital heritage dialogues in constructing heritage identities in Europe. This is an interesting work package in which I'm somewhat involved, which is partly about understanding whether it's possible to have dialogues that may be difficult, that may be controversial, where people may interact in antagonistic fashions over contentious issues, like Brexit, for example. And how that can actually be facilitated without a fist fight, and whether digital media can be a means of achieving this, for example, through asynchronous discussions that take place using digital platforms. Or, this is an experiment from the Discovery Museum in Newcastle, where an interactive has been set up that brings you face to face with historic immigrants into the region, in order to try and develop historical consciousness, perhaps to introduce ideas of intergenerational empathy and so on. Education, heritage, and identities, looking at textbooks, looking at curricula in different countries. For example, again, what is the role of classical antiquity in the context of school education around European histories. That is actually run by a group of classical archaeologists who work together with educationalists to analyze textbooks. And part of the instrumental produce of this work package will be materials for curricula and will be recommendations and guidelines for curricula and for teaching practice. How does that relate to different demographics within the communities and within the student base in different countries? For example, in Denmark, where we might be dealing with third generation or fourth generation Danish-Turkish students. And what then does the idea of Europe beginning with classical antiquity mean to them? That's a very interesting and political question. And lastly, food as heritage. And we could have chosen quite a few things for this, but this came out of interests of the partners to some degree. And it also responds to the fact that in the funding call, there is a range of topics that they mention. And if you don't hit them all, then you're out. You don't get the money, right? So there's a briefing document, and you go through and you pick out your keywords. And we made it easy for the European Commission by turning it all into a table. So, right, here's keywords along one side, here's work packages along the top, and here's a tick for every one that we cover. So that we show the reviewers, I'm sorry, you don't really have a choice. We are covering everything, give us the cash. And so that's what we did. And part of that was about tourism, part of it was about heritage and its relations with industry and commerce, and food is another way of doing that. But it's also quite an interesting heritage phenomenon with its own very, very complex politics, including things like documentation and origin controls at the European level, regulations that surround that. What can you sell as champagne, for example? Where can things be produced and sold? Under what labels and under what brands and so on? Obviously, how it relates to intangible heritage in the case of UNESCO, like the listing of the Mediterranean diet or the French repas, and what this kind of thing actually means for identities, and to what extent these are mythic constructs. So, for example, the Mediterranean diet is really interesting in that context because it's actually shared by a number of very limited locations within and around the Mediterranean basin, and there is not a particularly good intellectual or real link between those locations that says that these are the ones that characterize the Mediterranean diet. So mythic constructs like this. Last week, I was in Bologna with our Work Package 6 partners, listening to fascinating talks about food, which made me think, I've got it wrong really, because I normally go around and talk about Holocaust and genocide and this kind of thing, and there they were talking about food, and it was, it was great. So what they did there is they talked about the use of food as a way of producing nostalgia and mythic ideas about identity. If any of you have any Italian connections, you might know these biscuits here. Mulino Bianco biscuits, it's a brand, and how this kind of idea of an idyllic rural peasantry was constructed within the brand. As the speaker, one of our researchers pointed out, being a peasant in Italy when this was produced was not a nice thing to be. It was not a nice life to have. So this was kind of an ideal constructed for an elite and perpetuated a particular myth of, in this case, Italian life and Italian identity that persists to this day in this brand. So when we talk about heritage, we're not just talking about World Heritage sites or things like that. We're also talking about things like this that circulate in the commercial and public sphere. Why? What for? What are we doing all of this for? Well, the program that this came out of was the Reflective Societies program, literally, in full, Europe in a changing world, inclusive, innovative and reflective societies. And this is what we were asked to do. And it is a response to this European imperative. The core challenge of this, as you can see, was to explore and show how critical reflection on the historic, cultural and normative roots of Europe's cultural and democratic practices and institutions contribute to what they call an evolving European identity today. And again, this was in 2014. And these assumptions are about the importance of cultural heritage for communitarian and social relations, individual personal development, and inclusive senses of belonging. Valorizing, sustaining and transmitting cultural heritage are presented as a means of overcoming this idea of an EU crisis, marked by social and cultural divisions and disparities of wealth between nations and regions and groups, and reduced confidence in the EU in itself. So this kind of political drive, as I keep saying, was articulated sometime before a lot of the most divisive and momentous issues that exercise Europe and the EU now. So subsequently, we have the refugee crisis, bolstering views that both European and national identities and values were under attack by cultural others, fostering tension about quotas and responsibilities that aren't just quantitative matters, but go to the heart of contests about the role, the idea of civility within the European Union, and the idea of the role in the world of the European Union. In some quarters, the threats identified with the refugee crisis, imaginary or otherwise, like the introduction of Sharia law into British cities or harassment of women in public space, were conflated with EU freedom of movement, as you would have seen, often tactically by populist politicians or news media actors attempting to stoke fear, as in the UK prior to Brexit. So here we have, obviously, this really well known to us, Nigel Farage masterminding and fronting one of the most heinous pieces of visual culture of the Leave campaign, the Breaking Point poster, showing this long line of mostly Syrian refugees as if they were queuing at the UK borders, which they were not. This photograph was taken in Slovenia. Or, you know, other kind of mythic constructions within the press, that this one is very well known, threatening incorrectly on the basis of a very poor survey that will forever be used as a negative example in research methodologies classes. But it actually says, you know, the survey said, would you or a relative consider, you know, moving to the UK if Turkey acceded to the European Union and if Britain stays in? So there's so much laxity in all of that that it doesn't work at all. So threats that are mobilized not just by politicians but by the media, and I quite like this response to that. We better all learn Turkish because 12 million of them are coming. But what's interesting here is forgetting, because there's already been quite large-scale Turkish immigration into Europe, but this was in the post-war reconstruction context, not to the UK, or not so much the UK, but within the guest worker movement, the guest worker project in the 1960s and onwards. So this is a display from the Amsterdam Museum, which looks at the Ataturk barracks, where Turkish guest workers worked in the NDSM shipyards there. This is a photograph from John Berger and Jean Moore's book on The Seventh Man from 1975, where he decried this as a kind of economic fascism, which magnified the wealth disparities that made it possible in the first place between poorer and wealthier states, dehumanizing the guest workers, marginalizing them both socially and physically in terms of putting them at the margins of cities. And something that is an embarrassment to any member state that might think of itself or might celebrate its own multicultural, might celebrate its own diversity, its own attitudes and so on, but that it is now a kind of a quiet, not a hidden history, but it's a quiet one. So part of it is about that. So there's been some forgetting that's going on here, and we can compare this, if we want, to British post-war recruitment of workers from former colonies that's forgotten very often by far-right groups, as I'll show you. Now, in this country, obviously the results of the Brexit referendum in June refracted people's very different sense of position in relation to national identity and to European and global formations. And it's here that I think it's quite interesting, because any sense of the, any sense of fundamental unity, I'm not saying real fundamental unity, I'm saying a sense of it, or shared identity at the level of the nation, which is itself a problem in the UK anyway, as a multinational state, seem to be shattered. And I don't think much has happened to make that easier now, or to mend that. And along with that, difficult history seemed to be happening in the present, not just in the context of, sorry, I've lost my mouse. Never mind. And this came out in various discursive loops. So you might remember Werner Feynman's comment around the treatment of refugees, recalling the 1930s. And on the right here, this is Philippe Sands, who just not long ago on Radio 3 said something quite similar, that, you know, the idea that the atmosphere somehow starts to feel very similar to this kind of idea of a historic atmosphere prior to the Second World War with Nazi expansionism. So his question is, are we heading back? And this is a refrain that can be heard quite a lot. So these sorts of discursive loops are quite interesting in that context. They're not just, they are actually multidirectional in some senses. It's a commonplace discursive loop, but it works oppositionally. So defenders of the European project use the Nazi past as a cautionary tale against division. At the same time, EU discontents interested in recovering a mythical national sovereignty try to suggest that the EU is comparable to Nazi expansionism. So there's a very, very mobile sense of the use of the past here. I'm not going to read this out. And this is also an interesting one, but it shows in short how the EU crisis identified in the Reflective Societies programme is considerably ramified and exacerbated now. Ideas about commonality in Europe are both more embattled by nationalisms and also more divisively mobilized. And this is an example that I want to point to. It's a speech from just last year that you can see on this. You can actually go into the parliamentary records and read this. And this very, very kind of stirring and catching quotation here from Viktor Orban, which is a really, really strange conflation of an exclusive nationalism and an appeal to European commonality. So the way that these two things are actually jammed together in this statement is very interesting at a discursive level. The kinds of trickery that's involved in relating these different orders of identity to one another in a very, very strategic fashion. And it should make us think very carefully about any appeals to European commonality, to think about the rhetorics that are involved in them and the interests that are involved in them. So the instrumental understanding of European heritage suggested by the EC seems to lead to this kind of central problematic of the singular collective European memory. You know, the idea that there is a singular history, a singular identity that arises from that, a singular set of conditions that produce that identity. But it's fundamentally self-defeating in some ways. The idea of creating a harmonious cultural space and legitimating it legitimating the transformation into a kind of a super state in which we all feel happy, in which we're all content to call ourselves citizens, actually usually results in the opposite problem, that people start to deconstruct it. It starts to get broken apart, and we start to say, well, we're not the same. We don't have the same common history. We don't share the same things. We don't have the same lieu de mémoire. Or if we do, we're looking at them and using them and remembering them in different ways. So you end up with two sorts of projects of the discursive construction of Europe in relation to heritage. One is a kind of mythic utopian one, that there is a common European heritage. And that would seem to be the position that's promoted by the European Commission. The second one is a kind of deconstructive one, which is actually destructive of ideals. It's quite negative and cynical, and it says that there can never be this unity, there can never be this togetherness or this sharing, because these things never were, right? So those are two visions that are difficult to navigate between. Now, in responding to a European Commission call, you can certainly take the path of least resistance to get funding and go for the first of those two identity positions. But it isn't a responsible thing to do, in my view. And that's why there is this element within the project of understanding heritage, not just as a positive and a benign force, which is, to be fair, what you often hear if you go to heritage meetings in Brussels, but also as something that we need to take seriously in respect of social tensions, divided societies, social cleavages of various kinds. One of the other issues here is the problem of how do we situate the nation within this and the national perspective, and how does that relate to a supranational perspective, or even other perspectives, again, that we might think about, like locality related to particular locales or regions. And certainly the EU in this sense is a kind of a really testing crucible through which national and supranational, transnational histories and discourses and forces are encountering and interacting with one another, or reacting against one another sometimes. And this is all the more sort of critical now that various discontents are actually trying to kind of break the nest of the European Union, which itself leads to division because it is inimical to the identity position of what seems to be a large minority, which is people who attach to a cosmopolitan identity. So we are seeing very profound social divisions attached to that. What Philippe Sands said in his interview, and which has been repeated quite often in media space, I would say, is that what he said is actually those who attempt to attack things like the four freedoms and the European Union itself as an entity are forgetting that this is born out of war, that this is a never again kind of machine, that it's a project of peace. Never mind the bureaucracy and the difficulties and the quotas and all of the governmental issues. At the heart of it, there is this kind of ethical project that's connected to difficult history. And he's saying that there has been real collective forgetting about that. So one way between the two different kinds of routes that I was showing you there is, you know, a kind of cynical one, an optimistic one versus a cynical one, or a utopian one versus a dystopian one, is to kind of explore a little more this idea of unity and diversity, or diversity and unity, which is a catchphrase of the European Union. But to think of this in a deeper way, to think of it as diverse in and of itself in a historical point of view, with increased attention to the nature and historical depth and effects of difference. In other words, Europe might actually be characterized by difference. It might actually be its history might actually be characterized by difference, and therefore maybe what we need is a history that, and a set of historical representations and performances that deal with that, rather than the creation of some kind of mythic unity. This recalls to me Jeffrey Olick's idea that we should stop talking about collective memory so much as collective memory, that allows for antagonistic and dissensual positions. Or Nathan Snyder, who said there's actually nothing wrong with divided memories and narratives. So why do we keep pursuing at the official level a discourse or a narrative of unification and of commonality? And I want to quote this a little bit because it seems to represent a way through this to me from this book here in 2013. And he said, divided memories are not noise in an integrated system. They don't need to become united. They're not common. Common narratives are not common in the sense that everyone should tell them the same story. what we need to do is actually recognize that different narratives are there. And this recognition is the crux of the matter. So it is a conflict-ridden history. There are various groups who are antagonistic or have antagonistic views that are linked across national boundaries. And we have to try and live with this conflict without necessarily overcoming it. So that's one position which I find quite attractive as a way through this kind of dilemma or paradox, if you like, quandary about responding to the instrumental aims of the European Commission. Comparably, Michael Rothberg, in his formulations of multidirectional memory, talks about this particular ethical project of mapping or charting the conflicting claims that constitute the archives of memory in the terrain of politics. So the project was actually built around a similar idea, a recognition that ethics necessarily attaches to heritage. You can't get away from it in this respect, and certainly not when it comes with funding strings attached to it, that there is some kind of pharmacological usage to it in terms of righting the wrongs within society. But within this, a key priority is to remember that uncivil attachments to heritage and uses of heritage, as those like we saw with Breivik, or as we might see with the many people who go and visit Mussolini's house in Predappio in Italy 3 times a year, not out of historical interest, but out of ideological agreement. These things are ignored at peril, and the peril there is that we construct some kind of mythic, happy story of a heritage and a history that has been resolved, and that we agree on progressive identities and progressive social positions in intergroup relations, when we do not. We don't. Now, the project itself, as you can see, has skepticism about this idea of the singular European identity. And then you have this question, well, if the European frame then doesn't work, if there is no singular European identity, is the national frame a better one? And I think not right now. And this is my personal view that I will talk you through very briefly. Peter Aronson, who is a historian, theorist of history, and also ran the UNAMUS project, which has ended a couple of years ago, National Museums in Europe, which is another major EC-funded project, defined national museums like this. And this is where I'll start to talk a little bit more about museums as my field. He said national museums are defined and explored as processes of institutionalized negotiations, where material collections and displays make claims and are recognized as articulating or representing national values and realities. One reason for this convoluted definition is that what counts as a national museum in one country and in another can be very, very different in terms of scale, institutional type, and so on. So they're not amenable to a singular or easy institutional statutory definition. So this is what he came up with instead. But the idea of making claims and representing national values and realities at the moment seems to be quite fraught. Seems to be a difficult moment to do this. And the idea here is that the imagined community, as Benedict Anderson famously put it, is something that's quite embattled now. As you know, the imagined community is the idea that although we do not know each other in the UK, for example, we imagine some kind of community that is more or less unified. And that, in a sense, feels broken now because of previously unknown or unseen divisions that have become evident. For example, with the results of the referendum in June, suddenly we are aware of the differences within society and of different positions within society that were there before, perhaps, but that were not perhaps as clear. And this is an example that you can see here. Reviewing the Estonian National Museum, Rowan Moore in The Guardian said, seems like a very dangerous time to be developing a national museum. This opened in October last year. To be fair, I haven't visited this museum, and it got a glowing review from him, although he's mainly talking about the architecture. But you get the point. Now, if that is politically kind of sensitive, controversial, difficult at the moment to think about national frames and national views on life, on the past, then there are also museums who've taken against this idea from a historiographical point of view, particularly influenced by global history and by seeking to understand the history of the world, not so much in a territorial sense, certainly breaking away from the idea of nation state as an organizing force within historical visions. This is an example, Europe Meets the World at the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen from 2012. So these try to sort of represent the flows and movements between cultures, the migrations of peoples, the movement of objects, of ideas, of capital, and so on, religions through global space. And they deal with really, really onerously complex historiography. This is the problem. They're very hard to do, to curate, and they're very hard to make sense of because they're so complex. But nevertheless, this represents a kind of an attempt to break a national frame, and also in some ways to break a supranational one as well, because this is not just about Europe, it's about contacts and flows, movements around the globe, but crystallized within Europe. And this kind of attaches also to, or is coeval with, another tendency, which is to think in museums, certainly, through the frame of the individual. Forget the nation, forget Europe. What is it that the individual and the individual's life can tell us about global circumstances, local circumstances, what it means to live, what it means to be in the world right now? Particularly promoted by Orhan Pamuk, who, as many of you will know, is a novelist, but also more and more involved in the museum sphere, not just with his own museum in Istanbul, also, for example, as the ICOM keynote last year, whose ideas are having a lot of purchase. We don't need more museums that attempt to construct a glorious national history, he said. What we need is the individual frame, because we understand life and we understand history more through seeing through somebody's eyes than seeing through the eyes of a nation. What I find even more interesting, in some respects, is this idea from Jeffrey Orlick, which came out last year in a book that is connected to our project by dint of the editors. And he talked about multiple systems of memory: the region, the global system, the nation, localities, families, and even individuals as other analytical but not concretely independent systems. In other words, you can analyze them separately, but don't forget that they're connected. And he said they're not like matryoshka dolls, one inside another, but actually flows and effects can move between these from system to system in lots and lots of different ways. So I say, from a museum point of view, certainly, isn't it better for us to try and track this as a way of thinking about identities, about the effects of history, about mnemonic processes within society, rather than trying to attach to either a European frame or a national frame, or any of these kinds of systems, as Orlick calls them here. What if, for example, in museums, but also in other platforms for cultural representation, we can actually chart, track, and manifest these flows and effects across social and cultural space? I'm going to go back to Peter Aronson a minute, because he talked about the productive dilemmas of history, and one of these was, what is history's purpose? Is it to create stable grounds for identity, or is it to create grounds for a critique of identities? And this is a really critical question at the moment. He wrote this in 2011, and he and I were together in Lisbon last year at an ICOM event at the end of the year. And we talked a lot about this in front of the ICOM audience. And he was saying that some years ago, his view was that it should be about critiquing identities, but that now, given what has happened, given the rise of the far right, the development of populist political positions, because of Brexit, a threatened Frexit, and so on, he tended more towards the first of these, that history's purpose today, at least public history's purpose, is to create stable grounds for identity. He said maybe we can go back to this one in some years. So there's a very interesting debate there. I think I'm more here. But within this, and that means critiquing a European identity, right, as well as a national identity. Within this, there are ways of thinking about opening up different possibilities for positionality, in a sense. How do we, as individuals and as collectives, whatever we define ourselves and however we define those collectives, position ourselves as British, as English, as Scottish, that old game of demographic surveying and so on. As from Newcastle, how do we actually do that as Christian, as white, as whatever? All of these sorts of identity labels that we attach to each other, to ourselves and to others. How do we then open up a plurality of possible positions to make it possible for us to understand otherness and to understand with more consciousness the kinds of historical processes that produce otherness, and possibly also phenomena like prejudice. So within the museum, I kind of think of this in various ways, influenced by lots of books, from novels to academic literature to certain museums as well, like this one here, this is the Amsterdam Maritime Museum, and how these actually position us within history. And this is partly influenced by things like Michael Rothberg's ethical vision that I showed you before. Is it possible actually to use museums to do this charting that he's talking about? One of the problems here in memory studies is that this gets talked about at the abstract level, but from an instrumental perspective, what does it actually mean? So if you're a curator, how do you do this? How do you actually follow through on this with a display of some kind? What kinds of interpretive resources can you use to pursue this and to put it into practice and to make it evident to visitors? Can it be about developing the potentials for empathetic encounters with groups whom you might perceive as other and whom you might perceive to be fundamentally opposed to you as some kind of social enemy? Now, obviously, there are lots of problems that attach to the word empathy, and this has been critiqued a great deal, but nevertheless, the opportunity for understanding things from the position of others. Can it be about time? Can it be about historicizing things in different ways? This is a very brief example. This is a BNP leaflet that was tidied away in the Museum of London. The Museum of London presents a very positive view of multiculturalism and multicultural society in London. And the BNP for a while was in the habit of countering that by dropping leaflets in the gallery. The gallery staff were instructed to clean these away. My view is that this needs to be put in a glass box and put on display and historicized, and that we need to think of the present historically. So history isn't then what happened, if ever we can talk about that kind of idea, but it is a mode of apprehension, and therefore can also be used in the context of the present. In order to deal with difficult things like this, to understand where they come from, how they attach to things and connect to things. Or we can open up histories that have been forgotten, like this, the Ayodhya massacre, or we can try and deal with things that are very recent and quite difficult for us to deal with. So what if we put ourselves 200 years from now? What if we played a game within the museum, we call it serious play, of temporal positioning, much as you might in a science fiction novel or something like that, that asks us to reflect on this, or the refugee crisis, or any other contemporary difficult phenomenon. This has been forgotten, but if this had happened 20 years ago, we would still be struggling with the memory of this. So can we recapture that, the heuristic purpose for developing some kind of civil project out of historical consciousness here to make better civil relations in the future? So one of the things that I can say that we will produce in terms of practical outputs is materials to help, for example, curators, museum directors, cultural policy makers, to put this into practice, to take these kinds of ideas and render them as toolkits. And I know that's a horrible kind of translation of lots of extremely complex ideas and political debates, but nevertheless, at the end, that is what we are asked to do, and it's what is needed for any of this research to have any kind of effect in practice at all. So that's just what I tried to do with that, is really give you an example of how that might translate into one of the practical spheres that is interesting for us from the point of view of the project, which is museums. As you saw when I went through the work packages, there are many others. Final slides. this is what we are outputting, and you can see various outputs here. They all go onto something called the critical archive, which you can see on our website. And this is a kind of an archive of connected things from maybe academic articles, literature reviews, there may be films, there may be links to interviews, there may be some data that goes onto here. And this is open access because of EU rules, obviously, and so you can go and actually mine this and search this in different ways according to keywords, as you can see along the side there. So do have a look at this. And I think that's probably where I should stop. You can follow us on social media and keep an eye on the various seminars, workshops, conferences that we're going to run over the next 2 years. So I hope that was at least interesting. Thank you for listening.
We have time for some questions. So before I start by asking one, I'll open it up to the floor. Are there any queries?
I'll start off. Really interesting. So many different aspects and angles to consider there.
Sorry.
Very challenging. If I can take you back to one of the earlier slides where you had, I can't remember if it was the House of European History
Yes.
or the Museum of
House of, yeah.
Is that a museum?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we take that and then move to some later slides where you have the national museums.
Yes.
And the national museums were causing some discomfort because of what they represented. Does the European Museum of History have the same sort of reaction? Yeah, it's the content and design is very similar.
Yes.
Yet one elicits one reaction. Is that continued into the European one?
But that's a very good question, and I will know the answer to that in a year. There is a lot of disquiet around the idea of a House of European History. It's interesting that it doesn't actually call itself a museum, although it is. It has a museum collection. Interestingly, a lot of it is going to be organized through digital interpretive resources. So you're given an iPad as you go in, I think, and that's your main thing. Part of the reason that I'm not completely sure-footed with this is that, as I said, it's not open. So it opens in spring. And one of our plans is to go and do some visitor studies there, and to take, sometimes perhaps to take people there who have very different perspectives on the European Union and on European history in general, and to see what comes out of those in terms of accepted, what we might call people who accept the story, people who are oppositional towards the story, and this kind of thing. There's already, as I mentioned, because it starts in 1945, European history and European memory scholars are already getting their teeth into that, because this is so political and so problematic. It's as if, Europe before 1945 was not there. It's not significant enough to record at the level of the European Commission official museum. So I think there are risks associated with both of these, both a national frame and a European frame. And our job, in a way, is to find out what they are and to make. I don't think I can solve them, because that would be too complex. My only way of solving them is to present multiple perspectives and multiple possible heritages, and to show how contrasting they all can be. And that in itself should be something that's educational for the European Commission. If that is any kind of answer to your question.
I just wonder whether the collection, the curation is influenced by identity and desires to create an identity, and how do you actually avoid history?
Yes. It is. I mean, I've interviewed the director, and I will do again. And I was particularly interested in finding out the extent to which divided or social divisions and disagreements and dissensus, anti-European sentiment anti-EU sentiment within Europe would actually figure within the display. And she assures me that they will, but we have to see in what kind of way. I think the key message that I'm trying to get across in a way is to avoid fictions of any kind, which in itself may be an impossible thing, but by showing the different fictions in contrast to one another, then at least you can open up some kind of understanding of the constructed nature of representations.
Yeah, thanks. Following on from that, when you were talking about the people sitting in offices in Brussels,
Yes.
I mean, I agree with you in that it's obviously a spectrum. It's not two binary of opposing poles, but surely not everyone in those offices are saying, let's just carry on promoting this rosy picture of consensus.
Yes.
What do you think when they put the call out? Were they expecting someone like you to come along and not look at those?
Not do it. Well, I think responding to, I don't know, maybe you have your views on this as well, Sarah, but when you respond to calls, it's always a question of kind of subtly reframing what they have asked you to do and to make it fit with a. And they're funny things as well, because they may be produced by civil servants and politicians, but they'll be reviewed by scholars. So already there is a tension there. So if you do anything that's two-party line, then your reviewers will come down on you, and you won't get it, which is just in a way. But it does mean that you're moving between different audiences. It's interesting that in the reflective program, all three of the projects that were funded are to do with difficult, contentious matters within the European history. I mean, one of them, Unrest, which is run by Stefan Berger, even is about looking at things like media and political discourse around the exhumation of mass graves. So it's, Srebrenica and this kind of thing. So it's really, really difficult stuff. And the EC seems to have gone for this. And I think partly that was kind of, okay, let's face up to the fact that we're dealing with some division here. So we better, get some experts to look at it. And of course, the status of the expert in the EC probably still has a little bit of purchase, unlike here. Interesting from the point of view of this, when I was at a meeting in Brussels in October, we had a session with this, an EC policy officer said to me, are you going to actively promote European Union values? And I said, well, only if they coincide with mine. Well, not in so many words, but I said, no, we're not going to do this in some kind of evangelical fashion. What we're doing is problematizing things in a way that may or may not help, to promote a specific set of values about communitarian identities or something like that. When you're doing a project like this, you end up in ethical terrain of saying, okay, what do I think is good? What do I think is a good thing for society? You can't avoid it. As much as you might try, just unless you're going to be an arch deconstructor, then you can't do it. So you end up in this kind of territory itself. But most interestingly, the key policy officer who was there, was a guy called Zoltan Krasnai, said, we are not a ministry for EU propaganda. And it was very reassuring to hear that from somebody at his level. So I think there is a little bit of confusion within the EC itself about this. But that came from near the top, and I was really happy to hear that.
So slightly different question. So in the context of what I've been reading it there, COHERE, what makes us feel European?
Yeah.
Do you guys look at it in the context of economic crisis, so the boom and bust periods, and how that's, because you said there, I think I noticed it down, there's this kind of collective forgetting that it was established to be a symbol of peace, and that's very soon gets walked in economics, especially the most recent global crash. So in terms of lifting that out and thinking of it in the global context, how does that play out?
It does. I mean, in a sense, a lot of these identity questions and historical problematics are often connected to financial and economic ones. There was a kind of memory war between Greece and Germany about this a few years ago, across German and Greek media outlets, kind of throwing stones at one another. using historical representations to do that, as some of you may well remember. But I mean, at a more kind of prosaic and everyday level, we can ask what purchase a European identity has in a context which is defined by economic crisis of some kind.
And you put up there Brexit, the Nigel Farage,
Yes.
and his underlying statement there would have been, they're stealing our jobs, they're stealing
Yes.
our national
Yeah, they're taking up beds in the
NHS,
hospitals. And all
yeah.
that. Yeah.
And in a period of economic boom,
Yes.
that has less resonance
Yes.
than him playing off the
Indeed.
economic crisis.
Yes. Yeah. That's a very good
So
point.
how does it play?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I mean, what we are going to be doing, for example, is part of this is about looking at particular locales or contexts where this might play out. So on our doorstep, and to reduce travel costs, is a small town called Wallsend, which used to be a shipbuilding centre until probably about 10 years ago or something like that. So the shipyard's shut, which has kind of created massive effects within the local community in terms of employment, but also in terms of well-being and identity and so on. So in that context, it's quite interesting to think about what the hell does European identity or European, commonality mean in a place which has actually received quite a lot of ERDF funding for various things, connected to infrastructure rather than heritage, in a place where the authorized heritage is about Roman antiquity, because it's called Wallsend. It's the end of the wall. I don't have to tell you this. And actually, it's authorized heritage. They have the metro signs in Latin and all this kind of thing. But what do people really care about there? It's probably, the place where they used to work over the road.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And so the kind of purchase, I like the idea of kind of taking it down and saying, forget all of these airy-fairy discourses at the level of the political elite and at the level of heritage policy and at the EU level. What does it mean to somebody who lost his job 10 years ago? And what does it mean to that particular community? And what's heritage there? So, very good question. Again, Father Maureen again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, kind of based off the ideas, things like the propaganda and the potential for heritage discourses to be used for division.
Yes.
Do you worry that that's something that might happen with the work that you do? Looking at heritages within Europe, do you worry about them being kind of taken out of context?
Well, I mean, if you talk about, I'd rather talk about division than ignore it. And there may be risks that attend doing that, but I think they're not as grave as the risks of ignoring them. But I understand your question very well. But if we, if you follow the logic of that through, then we don't deal with things that have contemporary social purchase and pertain to contemporary antagonisms. And if we don't deal with those, then I'm not saying that what we do is not worthwhile at all, but at this particular level and within this context, I wouldn't be happy. I wouldn't be happy pursuing that. So I'm prepared, I think, to take the risk in a way, and always to have to retain the right to reply. One of the issues, I mean, I work with a lot of, I work in a department which is kind of hybrid. We have media studies, cultural studies, heritage studies, and so on. I've got a colleague called Darren Kelsey who works on kind of nostalgic mobilizations of the Blitz in media, and he talks about remythologizing. So he talks, on the one hand, we can look at mythological constructions, for example, of stiff upper lip and continue at all costs and keep calm and all of that. On the other hand, when that gets taken away by particular groups whom we might feel are uncivil, then we need to remythologize it and be open that we are also engaged in the process of mythologization, right? That we're not the right ones, And they're not the wrong ones. It's just that there are competing versions going on here. And so that's how I would probably take to that. But I think my version is right and theirs is wrong.
I had a question, kind of going off of what Jen was saying earlier. I was really struck by the point about the ethical project of the EU. And of course, other organizations like UNESCO and ICOM are arguably a similar ethical project, but at an international scale. And I wondered where that fits in, like because I mean, ostensibly UNESCO World Heritage Sites are about building a global identity. And I wondered, I mean, maybe it's part of this, I just wondered how you think these things intersect and whether that pursuit of a global identity is any more valid than a pursuit of a common European identity, or any more plausible as a pursuit.
I mean, I think they're both historical phenomena. I mean, UNESCO, and particularly the ideas around heritage that emanated from UNESCO, you know, have their roots in a post-war context of trying to create a global identity position that eliminated or attempted to mitigate against possibilities for division, looking at commonalities across the globe. In a way, it's so loose that it cannot have a particularly high level of purchase. And also, you know, again, this tense discourse of diversity comes in, because the World Heritage lists are so diverse and they make a virtue of that. So you end up with a kind of paradox of, yes, we're all the same, but no, we're all different, kind of thing, which is also a characteristic of the European project, that kind of discourse. So I think they're both problematic, and they both need to be understood as historical, philosophical phenomena. Outstanding universal value, or these sorts of tags that came out in 1972 that have a deeper set of roots. At the level, I'll go back to Jeffrey Olick and say I don't think that either one is preferable. They're all orders or systems of memory and systems of not just memory but also vision, right? How we see, how we organize ourselves, that we need to think of as interlinked and fluid, that we can link between at different times and places according to circumstances. As to how they fit together, that's a much more complicated kind of structural question about, how does a World Heritage List fit with the European heritage instruments, which I haven't talked about at all, but we have a whole set of researchers working on things like the European Heritage Label, European Landscape Convention, and so on. So how do these kinds of European instruments fit with UNESCO instruments? What happens when UNESCO valorizes something which is distinctly European, like the French Republic, and so on? These are kinds of critical problems. Also, UNESCO, as we all know, has a very, very unbalanced World Heritage List, even in Europe. So there are countries that do not care about being on the UNESCO list, or have very little input into it. The UK is kind of quite a good example in relation to intangible cultural heritage. So these things are actually quite hard to reconcile with one another, and they interlock in messy ways. But part of our job is to kind of track that. But no, neither one is better than the other or worse than the other. They are just different constructs within which we can orient ourselves. The key thing, though, is that we shouldn't say, forget it, right? Because you can't will UNESCO out of history. You can't will, however much you may dislike the nation, you can't will nations out of history either as a position of being, right? It is something which determines presence and life and what it means to live right now. So we can't just drop it all and say, right, nations are no good. Even if you think that, I do. But anyway, I mean, you can't do it. So you need to understand that this sort of historical constructs continue to have a purchase that you can't avoid. If I make myself clear.
Yeah, I actually think it's a perfect point to end on, because it leaves us with much food for thought. It's there, so how are you grappling with it in a productive fashion that contributes to the ethical project and so forth. So anyways, wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Chris. And
Thanks,
we're going to go to the pub, Eagle and Chad, for drinks and dinner. And so we can carry on the conversation there if you want. Thank you so much. Come next week with Sarah, May, same time, same place. See you at the pub, if not next week. Your mouse, did you end up recovering it when you were